Hello, everyone. Welcome again to the Doomer Optimism podcast. Today is pretty exciting because we have two people on site. Actually, Stephen Morris, who is part of our network and helps us produce the podcast. He is in Barichara, Colombia with Joe Brewer, and he is also part of the Earth Regenerators network. So without further ado, Stephen, I want you to introduce yourself and kind of set the tone for this conversation, and then we'll go from there.
Sure. So, as Jason's already said, I'm Stephen Morris. Let's see, how would I introduce myself? I grew up in suburbia in New Jersey, and I'll say it this way. I always felt something was off in the world. I never could get this work until retirement sort of scenario, and I had no idea how to deal with that. I also am classified in some worlds as neurodiverse with the label ADHD, and undiagnosed because I was born in '61, and I was the kind of drifted off, spaced out, fantasized. So I've lived a challenging life into fitting into systems and structures, particularly linearly. I've always been random kind of thinker. And so about 11 years ago, I was married for about 6 years and divorced. And as my life fell apart in that marriage, I started to notice the world falling apart. I discovered James Howard Kunstler, John Michael Greer, a guy goes by the name of KMO, who was doing peak oil stuff, and just all these interesting conversations that really made sense to me. And yet at the same time, I still didn't know how I fit in. I was mostly just focusing on the doom and going, well, I don't know what to do. Like, I have all these ideas in my head. I see better options for the world, but how do I implement them? How do I find people? So I was still kind of stuck in the system as best I could do that, mostly working freelance kind of gigs in audiovisual production. So I've been very much into the technology, a little bit into the techno-utopianism, kind of still going, ooh, there's something off with that, but I love playing with my electronics. I got the newest iPhone. I'm probably going to upgrade my computer one last time before the doom hits. So part of my motivation in doing this particular interview with you and with Joe is to kind of shed light for people who don't quite know where they fit in. They know something's off. Maybe they're not fully on board with the reset, collapse. I love Nate Hagen's The Great Simplification. It's a little easier to kind of stomach thinking of simplifying. Crash is rather a drastic way to relate to it for many, but for some that's maybe the best way for them to relate to it. So let's see, how did I end up in Colombia? Might be a little piece here, the story.
Because it also explains how I ended up sitting next to you.
So yes, yeah. that makes sense there. And feel free, Jason, if you got a question that pops up while I'm rambling here. So I've been studying various complexity, all kinds of things. I've been a self-help junkie for quite a long time. And, you and I met, I believe, through Twitter, and you were doing one of your meditation things online. Somewhere in all of that, I got hooked up with Nora Bateson and her complexity stuff, and that made sense to me. And Nora and Joe were on I believe it was the Future Thinkers podcast together. And I was listening for Nora, and Joe was there. And I was like, oh, something about him was like his commitment to real world action. Is someone who thinks a lot and doesn't act a lot, that on the ground stuff. And this was over a year ago when things were still very basic.
Yeah, here like you, Colombia. Jason, a nerd with hands.
Like that.
Well, and I'm a nerd with hands.
Covering his hands and, feet and tanned body, farmer's tanned body. Yep.
I'm a nerd with hands, and I found that most of the plants, in fact, I have like 3 plants that'll probably be dead when I get home. So that was itself was a frustration of, someone could tell me to garden, but I just making that leap. So I joined Joe's Earth Regenerators community, but basically ignored the emails that were coming in from, I got so many other emails coming in, that was just another one I could ignore until in December, I turned 60 and just kind of felt like, well, the first half of my life is over. What's next? And Joe announces one of his learning journeys, his 8-week learning journeys coming up in January. So I did my usual kind of procrastinating, hem and hawing, and the night before the learning journey started, I jumped in January. And I just fell in love with the way he presented collapse, the optimism in terms of coming together, recognizing what's going on in the world, and then working with it. So I did one learning journey. I reached out to Joe directly because he makes himself available, started to talk about my situation and interest in what was happening here. And it turned into a conversation of, hey, maybe I would like to retire here. I have enough resources that I could live in a Latin American country and get by financially. And so the conversation turned to, well, come out and see what it's like. And part of that is Joe's appeal to get to know the land, like the land that calls to you. And knowing that falling in love, like I usually do in painting fantasy futures, it was so wonderful to come here, but I really needed to at least date for 2 weeks the land to see what's happening here. So it's been, I leave on Wednesday morning to return to Colorado, which is where I've been living for 25 years. And hopefully by the time this podcast comes out, I'll have been telling the people who are dearest to me there that my plan is to relocate by the end of the year out here to Barichara. So that's sort of like the big path there, and ask some questions.
Yeah, well,
or Joe makes some comments.
Yeah, well, maybe describe more these last week or two. What has it been like coming out here, seeing, a lot of us are following, the work that Joe and many others are doing out there, and, with a lot of admiration. What is it like to get there and to see kind of the work on the ground, and to, I saw pictures of you like pulling invasive grass to plant trees, like just flesh out some of the
Sure.
Experiential elements of this, and also, of course, meeting Joe and having conversations with Joe about what they're doing.
Yeah. So I think, like many of us over the past 2 years with the pandemic, we've made friends. I've made friends, particularly like in Nora Bateson's community. I've made friends on Zoom who, when I meet them, they're like, there's just this connection that's there already. The greeting is, "Hey, you have legs." That's all we see is,
It's like, wow, the digital avatar can hug.
like that. So I actually got a chance. Joe came out to Colorado for a story of his own. So I got to meet him briefly in person. And it was just really, even that was like, a longtime friend. There's just this connection. And that's what I would encourage people looking, is find the people that you resonate with in some fashion, that you feel connected to. I've always looked for that. And then things have evolved to another community, to another group of people. And I try to I don't make enemies. Some just fall away as we think of life differently. So coming here, I was a bit nervous. I've been to Mexico a few times, and I've done a cruise where I've seen ports along the Atlantic coast. So I've seen South America. I was already warned, for instance, that there's no hot water showers here.
At the equator.
It's actually not that big a deal.
Cold, so it seems like the felt need for hot showers is probably greatly reduced.
It is. It's actually not that bad. And I've done some Wim Hof cold showers, jumping cold creeks thing. So the biggest thing I think was just I hadn't traveled anywhere in 2 years, like many people with the pandemic, and navigating. I know a little bit of Spanish, so I was comfortable with that. And it wasn't really that big a deal to get here, which is interesting, because I think of that background and my own sense of complexity and just kind of being curious and learning. Like I learned from Nora's work, and I'll be weaving in all the different pieces of the complexities of my life and talking, is really learning Nora's approach to relating to things is just as learning how to live. Like every day I'm learning how to live in this world in some fashion. There's a new piece of information that builds on the last one. So, okay, I'm going to learn how to navigate the airlines in Colombia and a 4-hour ride with someone who doesn't speak English. I got off the plane, got through immigration, found a guy with a sign with my name. First thing I said was, "Hola, me llamo Esteban. Hablo un poquito español. Hablo inglés," which is, my name is Stephen. I speak just a little bit of Spanish. Do you speak any English? For those who know no Spanish. And his answer was no. So right there I do. And then he proceeded, like a lot of people seem to, he proceeded to speak in really fast Spanish. So there was no way that I could understand any of the words he said. And I just laugh. It's like, okay,
Yeah.
that's what I got to deal with.
Yep, get in the car. It's going to be a pretty ride.
I showed him the address on my phone and took the ride.
Yeah, it helps to know that I'm friends with the drivers of a private taxi service. So I actually knew the driver that was picking him up, and
Yeah.
I could do the translation. But from his point of view, well, run up against the wall of language first moment.
Right. Joe, did you know Spanish when you were, I know you spent some time in Costa Rica too. Did you know Spanish coming to Colombia?
I knew some Spanish because I had 3 years of Spanish in high school and like the equivalent of a minor in Spanish at university,
Yeah.
and then 25 years without traveling to Spanish-speaking countries. So I mostly forgot it.
Yeah.
By the time I'd come to Colombia, I would say I had basic conversational Spanish, which is still really hard because there's the language part and the cultural part.
Yeah.
And so it was about a year and a half before I felt like I could communicate adequately, even with that foundation.
Okay. Yeah. So now you feel, do you feel like you're able to express everything in that you want to in Spanish?
Yeah, I feel like I have the fluidity to just make jokes, to sort of end the conversation, take
That probably
something
helps.
someone said,
Yeah.
and then weave it with something that's silly and off topic, and then bring it back in. All of that like cognitive flexibility that I have in English
Right.
as a first language, I can now do that in Spanish, even though there are always lots of words I still don't know because
Yeah.
I don't even know all the words in English, right? You just keep learning.
It's amazing to watch Joe, because in getting to know him and the banter we have in his personality, it's like I just see him switch to Spanish and I don't see a difference. Like, there's a few other people here who are in the small community. There's about 8 to 10 people, some more deeply involved, some are staying as expats here, some are passing through for indefinite periods of time. And, they're all kind of working with their Spanish, and Joe just rattles like the best of them, from what I can tell. Right. I don't know what he's struggling with or what weird phrases he's making up in order to communicate his ideas. But it helps. And that's part of what pointing to is it helps to have someone who is the intermediary, the trailblazer, the pathfinder, whatever I want to call him. And it's also a little like I didn't know exactly what to expect. In some ways, there isn't as much here as I was thinking. And at the same time, maybe, just like the reality check. A part of what was intriguing to me and wanting to come here was Joe's story about the ecoversity that he envisions here, right? And I've signed on with so many visions in the past and been disappointed by so many failures, mine or other people's, that was a big hurdle for me to come out here just to visit. But even then to think bigger, it's like, what if I attach myself to this vision and it doesn't happen? Then what? I'm, screwed, stuck in Latin America or something. God, our brains. And even in the process of getting here, the land that the Ecoversity is destined for is not purchased. And the beauty of living here on the ground is getting to experience emergence real time. Like there's a vision I have, each of us have, and then life changes, right? And there's
sometimes hour by hour.
Exactly.
Because the world is so chaotic right now.
And it's
nobody is buffered from all of these fluctuations of planetary collapse, as you put it, Joe. Yeah.
Yep, it doesn't exist. There's no separation.
And, what I found finding is I've had my own little versions, but this really is the deeper immersion in, oh, I've got plans and they change. Or I'm talking with Joe and he got plans. And watching someone else who's been living some version of this for 2 years as he's done all his projects and his sharing, it's like it's the kind of learning that's rubbing off versus teaching, right? We just talk, he shares, and the connections are made in my brain based on all of the things in my background. And I think that is the most important thing for many of us. I know it's become for me is to just keep relating, talking, listening, and sharing, not teaching and trying to get advice necessarily. Like there's places for that, but to go through the crazy complexity and the shifts, the advice that I could give or receive yesterday may not apply today. Right. So it becomes just sort of background information rather than rules to follow. And that's what it's been like in terms of looking at things here. What was we could talk briefly like the land purchase that was
before we get into that, let's flesh out a little bit of the larger context of. Do you mind, Stephen?
No.
Just of the audience, because we know what we're talking about, but.
True. Not everyone's up following us on Twitter, right?
Yeah.
Not everyone's come to Buddy Chat.
Yeah, Stephen, if you don't mind, I'll ask Joe to just kind of talk about.
We're just adjusting for the light a little bit here.
Well, we can get back into kind of like this track, but just to flesh out the context. Joe, do you want to just kind of describe what's happening in Barichara and what this vision is and how it relates to this larger network that you're helping to steward?
Right, and what he shares is what I got completely enamored with.
Yeah, I'll say there are two parts to this if we want to just start simple. There's the Earth Regenerators platform, which is started as a study group for chapters of my unpublished book, which has now been published. But at the beginning, it was just, here's the manuscript, who would like to discuss it? That's now grown to 4,000 members. It's 2.5 years old, has distributed governance, successfully does crowdfunding, supports its own members through an Earth Regenerators fund, like a whole bunch of things that happen in the global platform. And the global platform's vision is to build a planetary network of bioregional regenerative economies, or territorial scale experiments in how to live regeneratively that work at the landscape scale. And then locally, here in Barichara, Colombia, what we're doing is creating a living laboratory and a real world prototype where prior to my arrival in 2019, there were already dozens of existing projects, some of them 15 or 20 years old, some of them 3 or 4 years old, but all of them doing real regenerative work, restoring soils, protecting the native forests, community reforestation projects, education with children, just a variety of different things. So I arrived into a really dynamic context, which is, to be clear, it's not Joe arrived and created stuff, because that's not how any of this works. Evolution always builds on what came before. And so really what's happened since I arrived was I came with the vision of creating a territorial scale experiment. And can we create a regenerative economy? Can we create an economic system that is integrated with its natural environment? And do this in a way that has a learning center, which we call the Ecoversity, which doesn't fully exist yet, but many of its parts already exist. That could be a learning ecosystem that people anywhere else in other territories could engage in learning exchanges with. Well, we might learn things here and they could take them there. People could come here for immersions and then take what they learned to other places, go to other places and bring their learnings here, and so on. And so it's in that context that what I began doing in 2019, 2020 was mapping out existing projects. And by the end of 2020, we did some fundraising to buy a piece of land to create a nature reserve. And we set up an advisory council for a Barichara regeneration fund. And then from that, in the last year, almost year and a half, we have been building up a capacity to integrate the existing projects spread across the entire territory. And the idea of the Ecoversity is really all of the learning that's needed to regenerate a landscape with a unique ecosystem, with a really complex cultural history that includes genocide of the indigenous people, in a landscape that's had human habitation for at least 7,000 years. And then to create this complex learning ecosystem at the scale of 500,000 hectares, which is the scale of the entire regional climate. So there are a lot of pieces, but just to paint it as a big picture, there's a global platform spread around the world of people learning how to do this in a real world context where we're trying to do it at scale, and it's moving forward. So maybe I just say it like that.
Yeah, and it occurs to me with the ecoversity idea and this immersion, it relates back to what you were talking about, Stephen, with learning by being shoulder to shoulder, right? Rubbing shoulders and putting your hands in the soil, trees in the ground, etc. It seems like that's also of course there's also information transfer, I guess the more traditional way, but or not traditional, the modern way. But it seems like that's also the vision for the ecoversity. Do you want to expand on that, of like this, this approach to learning in place, in context, with real, skin in the game?
Yeah, I would say there's a beautiful network called Ecoversity Alliance, which anyone who wants to learn more, just Google it. And there are at least 40, and I think that the number's growing every year, so it might even be 50, places where people are already creating ecoversities. Some of them have been around for a while.
Oh, that wasn't your invention then?
No, that term.
Oh, another knock off the pedestal.
Yes, I learned it from a man named Manish Jain from India, but there are actually a lot of people doing this. Some of the oldest are in India and in Mexico, but they're all over the world. And there are 3 elements of an ecoversity. And then you'll see that these 3 elements explain why each one is unique. One is it focuses on unlearning and just processes of basically deprogramming ourselves from the culture of modernity, which means it's related to the second theme, which is decolonization of education. So decolonization, as you know here in this podcast, Jason, is multifaceted and touches all of our lives. And then the third is that each ecoversity is built around its unique cultural and ecological setting. So endogenous to place, with its own culture and ecology, unlearn the patterns of civilization and decolonize those ways of being, and then build pathways of learning for how to integrate into that local place. That's what an ecoversity is. So you can see how that could apply anywhere on Earth, and we're just looking at how specifically to apply it here.
Right. Beautiful. Okay, so that's some larger context. Maybe I'll pass it back off to you, Stephen, to kind of continue. Just we have that larger.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Well, so what Joe describes is sort of the ecoversity feels like the purpose of my life. Everything that I've struggled to put together and make sense of has the opportunity to be expressed through this entity. And I didn't know there were other ones. There's intentional communities, there's eco-village, there's all kinds of things out there. And as someone addicted to information, there's just no shortage of all that. It's like, how do I sort through all of that stuff, right? And so in the process, for instance, of referring again to my work with Nora and becoming a host in her People Need People community, was just really learning to be where I'm at and share and listen to other people sharing and kind of trust the process of emergence. Because I've been through this, got to have a purpose, got to focus, got to do these rules, all of that personal transformational growth stuff, which, had its place in creating me to be who I am right now. But prior to last December, maybe even through December, there were moments where I just go, what am I here for? How does all of this stuff, because I've got these little pieces and I would try to insert them into different communities, and usually there'd be pushback. I mean, even a perfect example I was mulling over is I hijacked one of the conversations on Twitter with someone talking about problem solving, and I've studied with a teacher who basically says the problem with problem solving is we create things as problems.
Yeah,
right?
It's contrasted with predicaments, for example, which have all these, or wicked problems, which have all these interdependencies.
Right.
Just as an example.
So, and there's a particular approach that I'm just not facile in talking about, so I end up engaging with people and then pissing them off and then, getting righteous myself and abandoning the conversation, especially on Twitter.
Or is that
What's
coming?
that?
Joe, has he pissed you off yet, or is that coming?
No, he hasn't pissed me off because I've actually gotten really comfortable with living in the nuances of interpersonal tension.
Nice.
So it doesn't piss me off. It sometimes I'm agitated by something, but that's different.
And I don't know. We're still in the honeymoon phase, I think.
Yeah,
You
give it a
know,
little time.
it's only been 2 weeks in person here. You know, check back in a year after I've been here for 6 months or something. But no, you know, I'm just thinking in terms of so the pieces all coming together. So what I've noticed is I see there's so many places for all the different conversations that I'm hooked into, all the different pieces, the complex pieces that I have, that if I give up my agenda, there's plenty of opportunities for me to share and figure out how to share. Again, the mutual learning, it's like, okay, how do I talk about something that can be of benefit to the conversation, but not from, I know the right way to have this conversation. And I'm seeing some versions of this with the community dealing with conflict management and other things going on that I haven't participated in because I'm not immersed in the community here at that level. And given the finite amount of time, I've focused on you know, getting to know and work with Joe. I mean, there's this kind of movement of building a second brain that some people have put on with knowledge management. My second brain is sitting right next to me. You know, there's this complex interrelationship synergy that happens, and in terms of like encouraging other people who are trying to find their way through collapse, is find those like-minded people and figure out how to talk and communicate with them so that that energy builds. And I don't know, I'm thinking of the car ride where we had that, for me, it was very memorable experience when Joe was visiting Boulder and we were just talking ideas and they're bouncing back and forth, kind of completing each other's sentences, knowing what was being said. And it was clear it wasn't three egos having a conversation. Something was emerging in the field, as we say. And that's what's exciting to me, is I could feel that pull here. Mm-hmm. And that's why I'm here. I have no idea what's going to happen with this Ecoversity. And that's where I have to calm my own mind. It's like, right now, the purchase of that land is in jeopardy. Mm-hmm. You know, and oh my God, if I move here for that thing and it doesn't happen, then what? And all I have to do is look at my life and all the ways then what's have happened, generally speaking on smaller scale. But I've managed to adapt, learn and adapt. And so I can build on that, knowing that whatever I'm envisioning probably isn't going to happen the way it is, yet little things can. Like I want to build a biochar solar-powered hot tub on the land.
Well, that actually makes me think of a nice example of these serendipity moments. Is the first time that I took Stephen to visit the land, Las Albercas, which is the land that we have a purchase agreement. We had someone who had offered to donate all the money. Part of the money was in crypto, and crypto markets have crashed. The backup for the money was in selling a house in California, and that's turned out to be more complicated because of other market dynamics. Right. And so that's where the land is back in jeopardy when it felt secure before. But we walk down, I take Stephen to visit the land, and then I show him the secret value of the land, which is the neighbors. Because the neighbors are already doing reforestation work, and this piece of land is connected into a larger context where there's some pretty profound cooperation already happening. So I introduced him to this Dutch couple that owns 8.5 hectares of land next to us that they've been reforesting already for 8 years. And they're just wonderful people learning permaculture and doing bioconstruction. It's a retired or ex-architect and ex-archaeologist who collaborate together. And they're both really creative, hands-on people that love to learn by building. Mm-hmm. And there's this moment where they're just saying, we need to update our septic system because we created a glamping site, put it up on Overlander, and woofers come and they do volunteer work exchanges. But we'd really like to set up a septic system because we're using a little more water. But we'd like to do it with earthworm composting because that just sounds like fun to learn how to do. Mm-hmm. And so they're really nerdy into the technical details. I'm sure whatever they do is going to be like Dutch elegance, meaning like really organized, really precise, and work very much not Latino. And I just noticed Stephen saying, wow, I always wanted to just be creative like that and try out and build things. Yeah. And it hadn't occurred to him up until that moment. that his ability to just try things like a craftsman or artist was very much the way this works. And I know you understand that, Jason, with the work that you do on your farm. That, he's just like inventing stuff all the time, just hacking it, bricolage, all that stuff. And it just hadn't clicked in his mind that that part of himself could be fully expressed, but there wasn't an agenda that advertised it before. It just emerged in the moment.
Right. And that's the trust, the complexity, trust the emergence piece that I wish I could just give people that I see struggling with that, right? And it's the kind of thing, I mean, you could have told me 100 times. In fact, who knows who might have told me that. And it's like I had to experience it both in the process of getting here or the example Joe's saying, because it probably was after that where I'm going, gosh, what I really would miss coming here is soaking in a hot tub. Now, maybe not so much in the equator anyway, but after a long hot day and then it's cool and rainy right now, it's like, it would be kind of nice to do that. And I don't know if I would do that project, but just the ability to kind of fantasize about that and imagine a movie theme, a storyline or something.
It helps. It really helps.
Well, and the culture that I grew up in, the way my brain is wired, I've been in survival. Even when I look at how well I've done, there's still the culture of survival in the States. And coming here with the slower pace of Latin America and, an aspect of, well, this is sort of I wouldn't exactly call it a vacation, but a lot of things have been put on the back burner that I'll have to deal with when I go home. That contraction will all come back. And the idea of being able to slow down and experiment. I've got tons of experiments on the shelf at home that just never got there. But not being immersed in that system. Like, I don't know, it's going to be interesting going back and, getting slammed in the face with some of the things that I have to deal with. And then looking at, well, what can I actually let go of, leave behind, just say no to, because I have boxes. I work in tech. I have boxes of wires. I have old laptops I've been saving to do something with. Do I actually do something with them, or do I donate them to somebody else who will do something with them now?
Yeah. Before we started recording, Joe, you were talking about how we need to get beyond this notion. If we accept that planetary collapse is happening, and we need to kind of like build these new resilient regenerative structures, that every person, if you don't know how to garden, or if you don't know how to do a particular skill, you don't know how to raise animals, you don't know how to do this, that, or the other thing, build a barn, that you're basically, you're out of luck, right? And you were talking about the importance of relationships and community, and really leveraging all these different kinds of skills that we have, in modernity, like Stephen, your skills in video production and technology, right? Like I can certainly see, how you would fit in, with the both on the ground, but also in the larger Earth Regenerators network, right? Which is a very high modern kind of enabled by kind of high modern technology, right? And so, but it just goes to show that, once it's really a paradigm shift, because once the paradigm shift happens, all of the things that have happened in your life that might have, been false starts or seem like false starts, all of a sudden,
exactly,
figure out how to plug in to really being an asset in, in this new kind of regenerative patterns. Joe, do you want to just talk about that a little bit more?
Yeah, I'd say what's amazing about regeneration is a pattern of any living being.
Yeah.
So anything that supports life is part of regeneration. And that means that we get these surprising discoveries in ourselves. And I'll give the example of my friend Rachel Olson, who came from Earth Regenerators and was in Bar HR for 2 months earlier this year. She has a background as a minister in a church where she actually helped with hospice and helped families go through traumas and crises. Like, she told the story of a family that had a bookcase fall on their 2-year-old child and kill their child. And then she did grief therapy for the family. And then later she did nonprofit management and fundraising. So she thought, I'll come there and help with fundraising. Mm-hmm. But she has a huge body of experience with grief and trauma. Yeah. And I mean, practical, Midwestern. She's from Illinois and Wisconsin, like Midwestern, down to earth, soft-spoken, friendly person who just knows how to relate to people. Where she went from being a woman who grew up from a little bit wealthier family in New England and part of the Midwest to eventually being sent off as a minister, as a female minister into sexist, racist Midwestern small towns, where she had to deal with all of the machismo and all that stuff that I'm from Missouri, so I get that really well, like you go to rural culture in the US and good people, but small boxes of thinking because they don't have a lot of experience outside of their local context. And it turned out she had this huge wealth of experience about how to navigate grief and trauma and the breaking down of stereotypes from all of that work as a minister. And when she came here, one of the most valuable things she did was she played grandma to my daughter.
Yeah.
And it's not belittling it, it's actually elevating it. It turned out that while she was in this deep spiritual process in herself, grappling with core questions about should she retire, what could she do, how would she find a purpose, that she found that braiding my daughter's hair before she'd go to school and thinking about her two adult children who don't have grandchildren for her yet, she's not yet a grandmother, how does she feel about dealing with collapse when playing with this small child while thinking about her own children, while making big life changes in her own life, and then feeling into all the ways she supported families as a Midwestern minister.
Yeah.
And all of that is deeply relevant to regenerative life, but it's not obvious that it is. And so turned out she had a huge value in decolonizing her own mind and being a supportive person to a family and community here while recruiting from her life experiences. And I use her as an example because yes, she can help with wealth management and inheritance as a fundraiser with these decolonizing patterns, but she can also help raise children.
Yeah.
And she also is just inherently a mother in her being, in her energy. But she sort of learned to devalue that in the colonizer kind of professional realms of what's valued economically and what isn't. And reorienting herself allows her to bring much more of who she is into the context. And all the while she needed to learn Spanish and deal with all the struggles of that. And so I'm just using her as another example of what Stephen's saying, is that once we shift our worldview, that what we're trying to do is build resilient communities, but we don't build them like you build a barn. We grow them like you grow a garden, except you are a plant in the garden too. Is we have to change ourselves as we relate to others. And all of that experience she had as a minister, and then later helping people donate money to nonprofits, which is basically people's guilt about living in an extractive system. How can they turn that guilt into healing by giving it to projects? That's what nonprofit fundraising is. If you squint your eyes, change your perspective, that's what it is. She has a huge ability to help someone who has wealth to invest it in regenerative projects and to learn how to participate by blending those previously separated parts of her life.
Yeah.
So that's what's beautiful as the categories start to break down, but the experiences and the capacities become enhanced.
Yeah. Beautiful. And Stephen, do you feel like riffing a little bit about, you said that, the Ecoversity seems like a kind of completion of everything that's, all your experience in your life. Do you want to try and riff on that, even if it's just, kind of thinking
Sure.
about it out loud?
Let's see. Well, rein me in if I go nuts here. Don't know that I will though. So, as I've said, I work in media production. I work in event production. I've worked as a landscaper for a summer once, not that long ago, since I've been in Colorado in the past 25 years. I do love getting my hands dirty, being in the ground like that. I mean, all those pieces, the work with Nora, the interpersonal stuff I've learned from the Landmark Worldwide, all these different ideas. It's just like the Ecoversity is a fertile ground where I see the opportunity for things to, create what calls to me to share in a way that people are interested. A good example is last night I did
I was just about to bring this up.
a somewhat impromptu talk about currency design and Holochain. And the focus was on currency design because we're looking here, Joe's been talking and other people's like, using NFTs or some kind of token thing, with Gregory and the Regen Network. There's all this stuff. And I have my bias towards Holochain. But more importantly, I want to support people in bringing new levels of awareness to what they're doing around currency design. And currency design is basically just creating feedback loops to support behavior in a direction that fosters what everyone wants. In this case, fostering life, right? So, and the Metacurrency Project and Arthur Brock and the folks around Holochain, they break the word currency into its component parts, seeing flows, seeing currents. So it was an opportunity for me to practice speaking this because I don't do this. It was essentially my first introduction to currency design in preparation for a program that will be released shortly online. But I wanted some of those ideas to be planted in this community before people went down the wrong path because they didn't know. If you design a currency wrong, you can actually implode a community. Right? Our current money system is designed extractively. We're living in that poorly designed. It's designed for somebody's function, but not for life. Right? So it started as I want to show these 3 video clips that I've got permission to share outside of the course. And then it turned into, they need a little more context. So I was able to go online, pull some of the pieces of information that I know, and just do a little 5 or 10 minute talk so that people could watch the videos and get them. That's the entire Ecoversity in my mind in a nutshell. It's like people doing what they feel called or drawn to talk about in a way that supports what other people are interested in. Again, not from I know this, you need to know it, but I know this, it could be useful. How can we discover together? After the videos, we had great conversations with other people who were more familiar with the tech, discussing Holochain or the currency, stuff they knew about currency, and people who wanted to know more, asking some questions and trying to understand, like, why did their time bank fail? So we got to explore and express together. And that, like when I graduated from college, I didn't want to leave because I liked that learning environment and I didn't like quite the rigidity of it. So here's a whole, and I've fallen in love with a possibility that who knows, as long as I can remember, hold the vision and then focus on what I can do today.
Yeah, and if I could add a piece of that, which is there are a couple of people here who know more about this topic than Stephen does. Like Chad Manfreda is here, and he's actually worked with a lot of these. He's designed and implemented community currencies in community projects and he's worked on global food systems and the economics underlying climate adaptation. And so what's interesting is noticing, why is it that Stephen was the one who was able to bring this into play, even though Chad is here in Barichara right now, and he came here to do some of this work. And I was just meditating briefly on it this morning, so I don't have an elaborate insight, but just a little, almost like a gut check. My gut check was Stephen's comfort with just learning vicariously by doing video editing. He basically offers to do video editing on topics he wants to learn about. And then he learns about them just enough to just as much as his ADHD brain can keep its attention. And so the strength of that, see, normally that's a weakness within formalized education, but within a decolonized educational context where ADHD is no longer a pathology. Here, ADHD is just a curiosity to find different things that might be interesting. And in this case, feeling the relevance and having the capacity to just pull enough of it together to hold a dialogue. And the holding of the dialogue is all that's needed. And then someone like Chad, who does know a lot more about this topic, is already doing work in the community, but he's doing it quietly. And now having it made just a little more social by what Stephen did as an impulse. He pushed or he catalyzed just enough that now everyone else sees more of what Chad knows. And that's going to help create an integration later. So this way of removing the idea that there's a teacher and a student and just seeing the diverse, multi-directional pathways of learning is a big part of decolonization of education. And the sense that you don't have to be the expert to teach, in quotes, to host a dialogue is an also decolonization of learning. And so Stephen being the just expert enough to hold a dialogue, but not more, and then also not feeling like he can't do it for that reason, but actually feeling empowered to do it for exactly that reason. These are little hints of how this is a different paradigm.
It helps I didn't know Chad's background that well.
Yeah, because you might have been intimidated by
I would have been
right?
intimidated by it.
But
I
that's
mean,
what
I
it
knew,
is.
you know, I knew that there's three other guys from the States here who have various backgrounds. And I just put this out to the community and was hoping they'd show up, but I didn't know exactly. I knew a little bit from talking to them, and I approached it from I do have a piece that they don't have. Right, because this is content from Arthur Brock that isn't known, or you'd have to scour the internet trying to find those pieces, and most of them are 4 years old, and so there's new developments with all that, and coming from the generous sharing of and the vulnerability of, like, I was fumbling through, like, people are asking questions, like, no, wait a minute, what are you talking about? So my intro wasn't even intro enough, right? I needed to back up a little farther. But I can laugh at myself in this environment where the pressure's not on in the same fashion where it is. And part of it is the environment that's grown up here, that Joe's found himself in, and that he's helped nurture himself, and everybody in the community is nurturing their own pieces of that.
Yeah. I think there's something really, really deep about this connection of this kind of learning you're describing, of this kind of diverse, multi-directional, complex, contextual ways of learning that's so opposed to our current kind of industrial school system. You know, it's really organized like we're industrial products, and relating that to Earth regeneration, to, you know, so this complex interdependency between this kind of other cultural mode that is actually very ancient, but, you know, in many ways we're rediscovering it, and, you know, how our relationship to the earth, you know, is either regenerative or extractive, and ultimately, you know, self-terminating. Maybe Joe, do you want to talk a little bit more about how you see this relationship between the culture, learning, and ecology?
Yeah, I'll start with one piece, which is to draw from the work of Andreas Weber, who's a neurophenomenologist, and he studied with David Abram, anyone who knows who David Abram is. And Andreas Weber has this beautiful concept for saying, what is the definition of life? And of course, this is a beautiful philosophical inquiry because life is hard to define. So it creates just enough edge of ambiguity. But the way that he talks about it, which I really like, is it's an embodied cognition, neurophysiology point of view, but it's also philosophical. And the idea is that there is an enlivenment that occurs when a living organism feels the impulse to stay alive. Like, say, if you stop breathing and then your body tries to gasp for air, there's this impulse to stay alive. And then he calls that the desire to be alive. And the desire to be alive, which is neurophysiological, or physiological if it's in bacteria or something that doesn't have a brain. And that this impulse to be alive, or this desire to continue living, keeps the search going. And I wanted to start here because this way of having passion, necessity, and curiosity come together is a place of enlivenment. We feel more alive when we're in these relational spaces, when we're in these ways of inquiring. And so this sense of feeling more alive in ourselves, which helps us to open up to new possibilities, less rigid thinking, more agile emotions, broader capacity to relate, all of those, when they're connected to land, when they're connected to restoration of soil or water or forest, that receptivity and that mutuality that come is where the deep ecological learning can happen. So, like we'd made the little joke earlier about, or maybe I've made the joke a lot personally, and I'll make it a joke, is, yeah, Stephen came here and he pulled some invasive grass. And I talk a lot about, well, I need to go pull some grass. And I actually mean something really multifaceted about pulling grass. And it seems like a simple act, but I've, over the last year and a half, really in the last 2 years, I have a very nuanced understanding of what pulling grass means in this degraded landscape with invasive grass that outcompetes and destroys native species, how there are specific sequences of actions for pulling the grass that enables the soil to be porous with a mulch layer that allows the native species to be dropped by the wind, that can then be nurtured while an ecosystem is being born. So I basically have this very sophisticated relational space where pulling grass is a part of it. And so to take something like, wow, there's this multi-directional field of learning among humans.
Yeah.
Now, what is that same multi-directional, like the phenomenological or the felt experience? What is that like when I'm relating to pulling grass and the restoration of land, where my receptivity opens me to learning from the bees when they arrive? It opens me to learning from the sequence of plants that arrive. It allows me to recognize when the reptiles that come to eat the insects, which is the filling in of ecological niches, and that same enlivenment, basically like a deep joy or a deep feeling of desire to keep living, which is this wholesome healing pattern. And so I'm really just drawing a space here where we can explore further that relationality to learning is related to how do we relate to staying alive, which is connected to how do we feel the aliveness in the more than human world, so that the connection to land and the connection to other humans becomes more deeply shared. So I see the Earth regeneration part and this relaxing of our learning models as being deeply connected to each other.
Beautiful. And Stephen, in terms of, I remember you had a post about pulling grass and then a future garden. Do you want to talk about what you meant by that?
Well, so that's back to the plan that I now see. The vision is to move here, become an expat in Barichara by the end of the year. And that's inside of what I've been kind of saying, hold the vision and then deal with things. So there'll be whatever I have to do to simplify my life so I can move, decide what I keep, what I'm bringing, all of those logistical things. In the meantime, that gives me a direction to move. So that garden is that was from, was it the Syntropic?
Syntropic agroforestry.
Yeah. So there's a project that started before I got here. They all planted little agroforestry area. And so it's just like Joe showed me how to dig out grass, which I was familiar with a pickaxe. So like, again, a lot of what's happening here is naturally emergent. I'm not so far ahead of my experience that I'm freaking out and shutting down in some kind of crazy trauma response. So chopping up some grass out at the roots, pulling it out, shaking it off. He showed me the basics. And it's like the baby step of everything he just said. I couldn't follow most of that, right? And I can think complexly. I'm just letting it wash over myself, which is how I've learned to handle information beyond my cognitive ability to deal with it. It's like, okay, I'm hearing a few words, I'm recognizing, I'm hoping this will apply to my learning Spanish in a similar fashion. I'm letting it wash over me, and then I'm noticing what clicks. And what clicks triggers something else that I can say, and just noting is that build on the conversation versus my ADHD impulse to just go somewhere else. So I really do see that as a possibility of that being future garden that I work in. And Joe being the pathfinder and having made his own journey that way from his own background, it's like, oh, I don't have all this head knowledge the way Joe does. I can't recite the people's names and so forth, but I can dig grass and I can watch bugs.
Right.
So it turns out it's really important.
Which apparently he says is really important. I mean,
I've digging into the complexity. I think it's great if you can express, concepts of complexity, but also living into it is a whole life process as well, which Joe, it seems like that's also been your process as well as, everyone, I love to listen to you conceptually, but it seems like you're also really trying to live into these concepts. And a word that, Nora Brayson brings up that I think is appropriate here is abduction, of being able to learn something in one context. And then and this seems to describe how you learn, Stephen, is then some new context, all of a sudden there's an unexpected connection, and it's not a linear process. Yes. Do you want to, does that word,
yeah, and I'm still trying to understand the languaging of complexity is being around Nora in particular is where I get that. And she makes up some words and a lot of them are from other places, but I do have a tendency, which my understanding is a lot of neurodiverse people can see certain patterns, even if they don't have the whatever other skills to express them or can express them in socially acceptable ways. I can see patterns. I can walk into a room. I can feel the space and something going on and not necessarily have the language, and I can imagine that, and I've had that some version of that here that I can't quite articulate, but all those patterns in life, I'm just sitting here watching them organically. And one of the patterns is to reframe or to remove the problem framing from things, from the work I've done with a guy named Robert Fritz in the creative process. And I just noticed, for me, nature doesn't have the cognitive ability to label things as problems. So it's just like, what do I want to accomplish and how do I get there? And then there's moving around things to get there or rearranging, but none of that is framed as a problem for the most part. I mean, if I cut my arm off, yes, that's probably a problem I should deal with from a problem-solving mentality. But otherwise, it's just like, okay, can I ignore this problem? I've injured myself multiple times here, put a Band-Aid on the cut and go on with my life. That's not a problem. And it's no different at a larger scale. So there's those patterns that work across context, across specific situations that I find. And as far as I can tell, that's true of life. But all I can do really is share, just like Joe shared his experiences. He's not, for the most part, telling me how to live. He's showing me how he lives and saying, hey, this is what works. This is what I've seen. And getting to have that rub off on me in a way that I can go back and share with people, whether it's on Twitter or Telegram, whatever, and in my friends, and not from a place of trying to convert anyone's view on what the future looks like.
Yeah.
I think that's really valuable.
Yeah, an example for me just came up. I don't know if it totally fits, but I remember when I first moved to this place, this land, the first few weeks, I got poison ivy really, really bad all over my body, like twice, two times in a row. And I was just like, oh my God, like this land is like, does not like me here.
Your ass.
And I've gotten better at noticing it to avoid it when I can. But in the last year or so, I've just taken the attitude of like, I'm going to get poison ivy occasionally. I have it on my fingers right now. But I've also, I also just don't really pay attention to it. I notice I have it, but it doesn't stop me from like going into the grass and like cutting grass or whatever I happen to be doing. Of course, again, I'm better at noticing it. So I think I probably have a more intuitive sense of like, it's almost like the land is like extracting its toll, which is like I've come to accept. But I've noticed that once I just kind of stopped caring even about kind of the pain of poison ivy, it's like, oh, it's fine. I'll just take a hot shower and then it won't feel bad for a while. It's not nearly as bad anymore, right? I get it pretty frequently, but it's pretty minor. And it's just a weird kind of flip where it's like, yeah, it's part of my life and I've accepted it.
Right. And you haven't eliminated the problem of poison ivy. Just like if you look at I don't know what kind of scars I'm going to have from the mosquitoes and whatever else has been biting me here. It's the same, similar thing. It's not, and I did wonder, like, I didn't never check with Joe to see if there are any poisonous plants. The mosquitoes kept me busy scratching enough as it is. But I see, here's an example of that sort of abductive process, or I'm not sure what exactly, the interchange. You just shared that, and it's like, oh yeah, mosquito bites, they're not a problem for me. If they were, I'd be spending my time trying to eliminate the mosquitoes or coat myself with, and it's like, no, that's not a problem. It's an annoyance for sure, but it's not a problem to fix. It's just a part of the predicament kind of framing. It's like, it's something to deal with. It's a piece of the fodder.
Yeah.
And I can actually train myself to be with adversity more on something as minor as mosquito bites that may leave some scars as I scratch like crazy.
Yeah.
But
I was thinking to add two levels to this. One is the level we're currently talking about, which is basically the evolution or the changing of our patterns of comfort.
Yeah.
Which opens us up to deeper, richer experiences. Like if you're more comfortable staying out in the cold of the night, you're going to see more shooting stars.
Yeah.
You know, like and I'm just using that as what's actually a profound example, but it's sort of simple in a way, is when we open ourselves up to different experiences by removing the barriers of comfort that modernity has given us, which I learned from bike touring and camping. You know, like biking through Utah with all the canyons and out. It's like, it's hard to bike through Utah, but it's so beautiful. And they have these really rich transformative experiences by being open to staying uncomfortable physically, to have a different experience. And then there's the other level, like I'm thinking of the mosquitoes, because I lived in a biodiversity hotspot for 10 months in Costa Rica, where there were mosquitoes, but there were also 750 bird species and 10,000 insect species. And while there were mosquitoes, there were enough predators of mosquitoes that they weren't kept in balance.
Yeah.
Here where we are, the big problem is the leafcutter ants. If you're starting to plant trees, the leafcutter ants are going to kill your trees by eating the leaves. And it'd be easy to say the problem is the ants.
Yeah.
That's not true. The problem is that you don't have enough diverse biomass to be able to survive the onslaught of the ants.
Right.
Because actually during the extended dry season here, the ants are the #1 soil builder.
Right.
All those ants they're taking into their colony underground are building soil. And so the problem, quote unquote, problem is not the ants eating the leaves. The problem is the deforestation already happened and the ants are left behind in an imbalanced ecosystem. Mm-hmm. And so we have to find a way to build enough diverse biomass that the ants are, basically we bring the ecosystem back into balance with the ants instead of dealing with the ants. And this holistic or whole systems way of thinking is another paradigm shift. And I just want to name both of those because they're both important here.
So let me ask you a question, because I'm thinking of back to this, like, well, you could throw me in any live event, give me a bunch of wires and things to hook up and tell me what you want, and I'll find a way to hook those together. You know, that's my creative skills right now. How did you like research the leafcutter ants? How did you come to that knowledge?
So I initially came to it from reading about biodiversity in E.O. Wilson's book, The Diversity of Life, where he explained that, you know, that's where you learn the statistic that there are equal number of leafcutter ants as there are humans on Earth. And the biomass of all ants is equal to the biomass of humans. And basically, eusocial species tend to have more than their quote unquote fair share. They end up taking over more of the ecosystem's trophic flow. So I already knew that ants need more of the biodiversity to be in balance.
You knew that coming here to be you knew that before being
I knew that before coming here. So that was something when I saw the imbalance with ants, I saw the lack of the other biodiversity because I already had a frame in which to see that that's where they'd co-evolved in. So I was just thinking that way initially. But then there was another piece is when I started pulling invasive grass in our food forest a year ago and watched all of the native bushes and shrubs come in and started planting chaya, which is tree spinach, started planting moringa, which is from India. And I planted moringa. The ants killed and ate all of them. The chaya survives and they never touch it. Then there's a native tree. See, chaya is from Mexico. There's a native tree called totumo, and the ants have an onslaught. They just like eat all the leaves off of it. But then a month later, the leaves have come back, which means it's stimulating root growth. And this tree that co-evolved with the ants is building its root structure, building biomass, while the ants are eating all of its roots on about a 6-week cycle. And just by being present and observing, it's like, wow, look at all of the native plants that the ants don't touch. Look at the non-native plants. Moringa gets killed by the ants, chaya doesn't. And look at the native tree, totumo, that is surviving the onslaught and because it co-evolved with them. And I'm just observing, what would I strategically plant to bring the biomass balance because the ants can't eat it? And it turns out it's ecological secession. Early stage ecological patterns, all of the native bushes, don't get touched by the ants. Some of the mid-ecological secession plants, some of the trees, do, but have co-evolved. Others are from another ecosystem where the ants don't exist and they get killed by it. So the ants are teaching me so much about ecological development, ecological health. By not seeing them as a problem, the ants are my teacher. And so there's so much to learn by being open to seeing how they behave that is so different from seeing them as a problem.
So I want to point out something here, because besides the car alarm in the street, another place where I'm sitting here, Joe's saying all this stuff. I can imagine listeners kind of glazing over at this point. The community, the collective consciousness approach is like, I don't need to know that stuff. He already does. Like I can actually, I've been training myself in like, what do I need to know? What don't I need to know anymore? To, give up my information addiction to what can I actually use on the ground? So Joe's already blazed that trail for me. And I'm imagining, because I'm partially putting myself in the place of the audience listening to this, as I've listened to other things. One that sticks in my mind is Jeff and Donkeys and his constant urging to simplify and slow down and stuff. It's like, I can't make all those changes, but his little voice is in the back of my mind reminding me to slow down, right? It's like there's something that can be taken from this, what Joe's just shared, or this whole experience that we're reflecting. It's like the conversation on Twitter right now of 60-year-old farmers, 10 generations or something, and no legacy to leave because their kids aren't interested. It's like there's an opportunity there for new relationships to show up by people who want to become homesteaders and having a clue how to get started. I mean, if I was really interested in homesteading, one of those opportunities I would jump on that. I've done an equivalent here with Joe. It's like not going so far ahead of myself that I don't see what the next step is, and I start, again, we'll come back to this kind of problem thing. It's not a problem that I don't know what the next step is if I stop and just look and see what's the next step that is not so far out that it's traumatizing, and it's not perpetuating what I no longer want to continue to nurture.
Yeah. Well, this seems to really speak to the concept that you've spoken about, Joe, about cultural scaffolding, right? Because even this idea of homesteading, like doing it yourself or with just your family, like that's kind of a fantasy, right? Like the real stuff is in community, in interdependent community, of like having this cultural scaffolding that can support people, to like it takes a lifetime, right? And even in cultures where it's a norm, a 10-year-old, can do probably 10 times more than somebody, who wants to be a homesteader comes in and spends 10 years, right? It's just because it's so much part of the cultural scaffolding. And it seems like that's kind of ultimately what we're talking about building is this kind of eco-cultural scaffolding. And it's little by little, right? It's taking our time. It's noticing, the abductive process. It's noticing these connections, and it's picking out what is relevant for me right now at this moment that can move me forward towards this next thing, which ultimately is like this web of cultural scaffolding. I don't know, Joe, do you talk about that?
I'd love to apply what you just said to the grass.
Yeah.
Because I have two moments of cultural scaffolding that I can describe that start to show how this works. The first one is we have Bioparque Moncura, the 6.5 hectare community project. And 2 years ago, just as a volunteer, there was a 1 hectare part of that land that myself and about 20 other people, in like 3 days, we went and pulled a bunch of invasive grass. And then in the next rain cycle of about 6 months, we watched a bunch of bushes and shrubs grow. So the first cultural scaffolding was participating in someone else's project and then watching this change happen. And then I visited the private nature reserve of a biologist here named Oscar Guilherme, who showed us an intervention he had learned about how to pull grass, where he said, notice on my farm, I pull the grass right along the edge of the tree line where there's this seed bank of native bushes and trees. And all those seeds can drop where the grass has just been removed. And I hadn't connected the dots that we should pull the grass next to existing native plants. But after seeing him do it, I came back to the Bioparque in the next cycle of rain, and we pulled grass next to the place we'd pulled grass before in that volunteer work. But this time we did it where there were native bushes and shrubs on 3 sides. And in the span of 2 weeks, we pulled a bunch of grass. And that meant now I had 2 experiments where the Bioparque itself was a scaffold. that learning opportunity to volunteer and then going to Oscar's land were both scaffolds. And so in the first year, the bushes moved in, but it was kind of monoculture. It was one kind of bush that shot up and took over. But 2 years later, the invasive grass is taking over again. And in the second place we did it, where we did it with the 3 sides, more biodiverse bushes and shrubs came in. But a year later, without maintaining it, the invasive grass is starting to slowly take over, but more slowly than the other land. And then when I started doing the work on the third piece of land, which is where we have our food forest, and I pulled grass, I pulled the grass in one part where I pulled all of the, like in the roots of the grass, there's all this clod. And in one part of where we pulled the grass, I did an accidental experiment. I broke apart all that clod and made a mulch layer with the nutrient-rich soil that was in the clod. But in another part, I didn't. And then when the rain came, I just happened to notice where I'd pulled the clod and made a mulch layer, all the native bushes and shrubs came. But in the other area, it was compact soil during the dry season, and nothing came.
Right.
And so then I shared that with other people as we started expanding that process, and we started spreading a sort of frontier approach of where these native bushes and shrubs, we would maintain it by weeding the invasive grass as it grew, which means my own learning is now a scaffold to myself and a scaffold to other people. Now I'll stop there before it gets too complicated, but I just want to show you that the way I learned about invasive grass in 2 years was accumulation, cultural evolution, accumulation directionally toward how to build the context for ecosystem health.
Right.
And I could do that in 2 years by building on other people's experiences.
Right.
Now think of what Stephen can do when he shows up here, and he can benefit from all the scaffolding that I embody and that these places embody. Because there's one moment when Stephen arrived where I walked him to the place where we pulled grass 2 years ago, looked across the trail 10 feet away and said, over there we tried a different approach. And then we walked 200 feet to the third one and said, and here we've accumulated learning. You can see how different it is.
Yeah.
And so the whole bioparque as the school is this tremendous scaffolding infrastructure.
Yeah.
So that's what the Ecoversity can do, is it can accelerate this learning directionally in ways that means I could benefit from the 15 years of work Oscar Galete had done, together with the 14 years of work in the bioparque, with my own learning process of gathering scaffolds.
And I don't have to try to understand all that.
Right.
I can start where he's scaffolded to.
Right. But when you're out there looking at these 3 successions, the 3 plots, I mean, it's you see it, right? Like it's
right. It's like, okay, this
better.
This was done that way on the ground. Like I don't have to think about it. I don't have to theorize. It's like you pull the grass, you do this, you do that. Very, very mechanical, very non-intellectual, and for someone with an overactive brain, that's particularly nice because I can just show me what to do. And in that process, I can notice.
Yeah.
Right. But I don't have to do all that other stuff. And that to me is part of the essential, Jeff saying slow down, or various versions of that. It's like, as the mother culture calls us to move faster and faster, there's this, I can't do that anymore myself, especially being here now. So I go back to, well, it's going to be interesting to place myself back in Colorado where things are still kind of growing and blooming, to how to adjust that pace and contrast the two. What can I leave behind? And just notice, I can, even where I am, we'll see. I'll have to, if I notice something, like share it on Twitter, maybe at the time that this podcast is finally released, I can follow up with it. And this is what I've noticed since returning. Trying to go fast blows past all those opportunities to learn.
Yeah.
Like if I'm just trying to get the grass out.
Yeah, and you've seen that because I showed you one day, there was someone who came to the bioparque who was really distracted in a sort of agitated emotional state. And they pulled the grass badly, meaning they left some of the clods of the root structure there. And this is Brachiaria. This is like the most badass grass you can imagine. You leave just the tiniest shred of it, and the next rain, it's going to come and take over again. And so there's a very just mindful way of being meticulous. You're not meticulous like anal retentive. You're just like, did I get all the roots out or not?
Yeah.
And if you're going slow enough, you notice, and there's sort of an aesthetic quality to it,
Mm-hmm.
or really a quality to it. And this was someone doing low quality work. They're just like ripping off the top of the grass, leaving the roots there, because they don't know that all those roots are just going to stimulate more grass growth. And so this difference between going slow enough to notice what is a good job
Yeah.
is, I mean, that's so basic to any kind of good work. Think of woodworking or leather work or painting or writing a story. It doesn't even matter what it is. The quality is totally different if you slow down and notice.
Yeah.
So that's a really big thing about the aesthetic of this way of living and the aesthetic of this way of learning. Because there's no performance anxiety for outcome. You're not stressed about doing a bad job with the grass. That would undermine the whole process. It's just you've calmed yourself enough as a mindfulness practice that you notice more.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's funny that, often mindfulness is sold as kind of a productivity enhancer in the high modernist world. And it's completely just defeating the point. You're supposed to bring the high modernist world down to your mindfulness practice and actually, focus on the quality and the, probably you can say exponential, it's like, it seems like you're going slow, but the fact that, the difference between grass, this badass grass, you're saying the most badass grass in the world, returning with the fury or not returning with the fury, is huge, right? It's like, that's the equivalent of a lot more work that somebody could do, whether they're going slow or fast, right?
Yeah, because what we're doing is leveraging the power of one of the most powerful natural forces on Earth, which is ecological secession.
Yeah.
But most people don't know this.
Yeah.
If you have the right niche forming process,
Yeah.
diversity fills it.
Right.
Just nature has 3.5 billion years of filling niches.
Yeah.
And so if we understand that, removing the grass in a way that creates this open soil substrate, knowing that the neighboring plants are close enough that the wind can bring them, and there are just enough trees and bushes that the birds will come and poop them, that basically those ecological pathways exist.
Yeah.
Just by opening it up and keeping the invasive grass out long enough,
Right.
is like the rest of nature does 99% of the work.
Right.
And in 1 year, we have like stage 2 ecological secession because we're in the tropics. It wouldn't happen that fast in mid-latitudes. But in 1 year, we have stage 2, like we're on our way to becoming a forest by just getting the grass out of the way in an intelligent path.
Yeah.
So by understanding that, we do a lot less work
Yeah.
because it's leveraged by the context.
Right.
And
Right.
we're able to slow down and enjoy even more of it.
Right.
And that brings to mind, speak to what was happening in the bioparque before you started this process, because so there's the people who were managing the park before Joe arrived here were approaching it in a more modern context, I guess you could say, in terms of bringing trees and trying to nurture the park. I'm
Yeah.
thinking specifically of just planting trees.
Well, this may relate to an interesting distinction between positive ignorance and negative ignorance. Or I'll say positive and negative with respect to your purpose. Like if you have a negative ignorance, that means it undermines the ability to achieve what you're trying to do. Positive ignorance is the humility to not know, but it actually supports learning, which helps you get to what you're trying to do. So I want to make this distinction because the bioparque is this incredible experience of 2 women who knew nothing about how to grow forest, like an incredible amount of ignorance. And what's beautiful is they just kept going.
Mm-hmm.
And now it's on its way to being a forest. Yeah. But where I've been pulling grass, they haven't worked in that part of the bioparque in 10 years. Yeah. Because it's 6.5 hectares, which anyone who's worked with land, that's a lot of land.
And how much is that in acres for those who don't know?
It's approximately double. So think like 13 acres of land. Yeah. And so there's this 1 hectare or 2 acre plot they haven't touched in 10 years. 90% of the trees they planted died because the soils were so bad when they started. And it's just trees and grass. Mm-hmm. And a forest has 10 levels. This is 2 levels. Yeah. So in 10 years, what's happened is less than 10% of the trees survived, and those that did are growing, but under them is invasive grass. Mm-hmm. And the rest of the bioparque is like they did not know how to do water retention. Mm-hmm. The first composting project was after I arrived. They didn't know how to do soil building. and they didn't know ecological secession. So they planted trees and they try to keep the trees alive without all of the forest canopy structure that helps trees survive, while this invasive grass just persists. Whereas I show up with ecological knowledge. And so I have no idea about how this ecosystem works, which is positive ignorance, meaning I stay open to learning. But I also know enough that we have to get the invasive grass out of the way for the ecological secession to begin, which is my positive knowledge. And the negative ignorance of these two women was they did not know how to remove the grass to create ecological secession, which was water retention, soil building, and opening of niches, which is stuff that I knew, which a good permaculture student would know, but they didn't. So that's what's interesting about this is I don't know how this ecosystem works, but I know how ecosystems in general work. And it's the combination of that humility together with some knowledge that accelerates the process.
Right.
And in this 1 hectare lot, we're showing how to remove the grass strategically to let nature do all of this work. And the two women who have been doing it before are just like, thank you, Joe, for bringing this ecological knowledge. We will now apply it everywhere else in the bioparque.
Yeah.
So this blend of positive and negative ignorance is really, really important here. And notice, I'm not saying I know everything. I knew nothing about the native plants. They know way more than I do about the native plants. But I knew ecological secession in a sort of abstract way.
Right.
And it's the combination in a place,
Right.
the physical experiment. That's where the magic happens.
Right. And that again speaks to this conversation we've talked about here is like all of these different skill sets and sets of experience, you know, coming together in context for, you know, a vision, for a goal, you know, of ecological regeneration and also, you know, human cultural regeneration. All of a sudden it can produce magic, right? It can produce, you know, well, it's not, you know, the magic really is, you know, providing, you know, the context in which an ecosystem can do what it knows how to do, you know, much better, faster, than we could do on our own, right? And so that just seems like another great example of this. So we're getting close to time, or we've almost been going 90 minutes. So I want to give, I guess, both of you a chance for final words before we wrap up. Whatever you want to leave the audience with.
Sure. And I had this little phrase. If I can remember the phrase, once I get to the point, or what I see with what Joe is saying is early on when I started, earlier this year when I started actively participating in the online Earth Regenerators community on Mighty Networks, was someone came in and said, we just got to plant trees everywhere. We just plant trees everywhere. That'll take care of the global warming issue. That's the problem-solving mindset that focuses on one particular piece of a whole complex issue. And I nurtured a conversation around maybe there's a little more effective way to do that. And some other people chimed in, like, first we've got to grow the water, which I'd never heard that expression myself, which I thought was really, you know, it's building soil, it's all of those pieces. And what I've found for myself is that I've worked both the knowledge, which didn't seem to apply to regeneration until recently, and also at the time my personal growth junkie thing had me looking at all kinds of ways to better myself. And I'm done with that from that kind of approach. There's still growing and nurturing myself, but I'm not trying to better myself in the same way. And I've done enough work on healing whatever has me acting out of unconscious impulse that ends up being negative, bad ignorance, right? So this well-meaning person was like, let's plant trees everywhere. And Joe's given an example of what happens if you just plant trees without understanding the whole process. It would be far more valuable, I see, that if he and his community could support him in healing whatever the issue is that says, let's plant trees. Like, I have to look at myself as like, when I've got that impulse, what am I ignoring in my being and the way I'm interacting in the world that has me rushing around with that urgency
Right.
that has me step over the next piece of emergence, because that jumping beyond the next step borders on re-traumatizing myself, recreating, perpetuating the pattern that doesn't support the growth. And I would just end for myself with the thought of live the question, don't seek the answers.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah. I would like to say the way that Stephen and my relationship really began was he was considering donating some money to support the work we're doing here. Just like having this impulse, you're doing something important, maybe I could help. And I intuitively felt the significance that we should build a relationship and we should become friends, and that he might want to use the money he has in some other way, because I don't know what's really his highest, not his highest sense of purpose, but maybe his most integrative capacity to manifest himself as a regenerator. Meaning he may be able to put himself into another process that works better, or we may go about this process differently. And one thing that I think is really proven true about that intuitive gut feel is that you can see now, as Stephen and I are sitting next to each other and having these conversations and how far this inquiry comes, that the question should never be, I have X amount of money, what should I do with it? Or I have X capacity, like I know this and I could bring it. It doesn't matter what it is. Is how do I notice the way that I'm relating that might help me to relate better to what heals things? Just like help me relate to healing. Because you know, if I'm sitting like me, Joe, here talking to someone like Stephen who I don't know yet, like, I don't know you yet. So I intuitively feel this heart connection, and I'd like to help you. I like to be able to be your friend, but I'm not your friend enough yet to know how to help. That's a good impulse. Let's start there. He has an impulse. I feel like what you're doing is important, and you may know better than me how to use some of my money. Well, that's a good impulse. But if we go to an answer instead of staying in the question, as you're saying, we don't see that there's a rich tapestry of relationships we can build. And I think this is that part that Stephen has named several times in our conversation today, that if you go too far ahead of your own change process, you lose your ability to take meaningful action. And so to notice that tendency and then just come back to a place of center again and say, what is the most elegant next step that I should be taking right now? I think that is not only a gut check that's right, I think there's deep wisdom in that. And the whole idea of Doomer Optimist as a frame for me, which I think I have a similarly sophisticated view as how you look at it, Jason, is we hold the tension between the polarities. We just hold the tension. It's like, yes, there's doom. Yes, there's optimism. Both of them are too far. What is the tension? And like, okay, I need to change my life, but I can't go too far. Hold the tension. And I think this daily meditation, or even moment to moment, I want to change. How should I change next? What kind of support do I need to change next? The absence of that space is why most people don't change. And so just continuing to hold that for everyone in this community, that I think Stephen is embodying really well, and recognizing you're in it and now you want to share it. That was your impulse for us to record this conversation.
Right.
So maybe I'll pass it back to you to close it and say, I think that impulse is correct. So is there anything else you want to say as we close, just related to that? Maybe not, but
no, it's like no, there is you know, it's a sense that there is the capacity, like we all have it. I have it, and it's finding the support for that next little step. And not, if I've been through in and out of feeling like, oh, I need a sense of purpose. And I think of Gregory Bates and Nora's father's criticism of conscious purpose. It's like by focusing on a purpose, I lose sight of the other opportunities in the complexity that can present themselves. So it's not the same thing to say moving towards a regenerative lifestyle is living a purpose. but there's lots of, we're talking about nuance, and like there's so many subtleties and nuances in the way we use the words and the way I think that, back to Jeff and donkeys, slow down, pay attention, notice what's right under my feet.
Right.
And there was a tension to get here. I wanted to be here sooner, and I showed up at the right time.
Yeah. Hmm.
And I really think that's true for everyone. If they slow down, they'll show up at the right time.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Anything you want to put on this from your point of view as we close it?
Yeah, I mean, it's causing more reflection for me about, I think just the mindfulness of, thinking about, grand scale visions versus, what's kind of the adjacent possible, and what's the adjacent healthy, right? Like slowing down, what's the next step that moves towards health, right? So I think I'm just sitting with that notion for myself and within my own day, and I have things to do. I have errands to run, but stressing me out a little bit. But it's helping me to like, okay, just slow down. They'll happen. I don't need to be contracted about it. I can be open to it. So that's what I have to leave with. Is I think this has set me up for my day and hopefully my week, and hopefully helps me on my trajectory. So I thank you guys. I think this has been a beautiful conversation. I love this dynamic. I think the two of you and the subtle tensions I noticed, but also the clear camaraderie is beautiful, and living the tension. I think that's what it's all about. So
thanks. And we didn't plan on matching shirts. I don't know how
that was totally
it was totally accident.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Cool. All right, so I'll stop recording here, and we can wrap up. Take care, everyone.
Thank you, Jason.